Hello, everybody. We're going to talk about China's one child policy. The aim of this lesson is to know the reasons for China's one child policy and to explain what it was. So, let's start. In the middle of the 20th century in China, families were encouraged to have very large families. This is because political ideologies said that the more people, the stronger we are. In fact, if we take a look at the birth rate in China, going back to the beginning of the 20th century, we see that the birth rate is actually quite high. The Great Leap Forward was the time where Chinese were encouraged to have large families. At the time of the 1970s, many countries around the world were worried about population growth. And China already started taking an extreme approach to the problem. They ran a program called Late, Long, Few, encouraging people to get married later in their life and have fewer children. This already started dropping the population and the birth rate. But by 1975, they realized that the country was still facing food shortages, and they were afraid that they would have a huge famine like they had in 1962. This is the time they decided to introduce the one child policy. At this time, the population was growing by 55 million people every 3 years. They needed to do something very quickly and drastically. So, moving on, in 1979, they decided to introduce the one child policy. The one child policy restricted families to have one child per family. This was one of the posters that they used. Part of the one child policy was that they raised the marriageable age for men and for women. They raised the age when people could get married because usually people would have children after they get married. So if the age when you get married is later on in your life, you're likely to have less children. During the one child policy, couples had to apply first to be married and then they had to apply again to have a child. After 1979, there was a man and a woman. They were in love and wanted to get married. The man had to be over 22 years of age and the woman had to be over 20 years of age. If the couple was at the right age, they could apply to get married. The application was accepted, they eventually could get married. Once they did get married and they decided to have a child, they had to apply before having a child. Once the application was accepted, they could then have the child. Couples who obeyed the one child policy were given free education, priority housing, and even family benefits. However, the couples who did not abide by the one child policy and decided to either get married when they were younger or to have children before applying for them didn't have any benefits. In fact, they were fined, and sometimes their property was taken away from them, or they lost their jobs. Women who became pregnant with a second child were frequently forced to have an abortion. After having their first child, women were given contraception so they don't get pregnant again. And if they had two children, they would be sterilized. If they had two children, they were offered sterilization, many times by force. The people who refused this would be denied access to public schools and even health insurance. People who worked with the government lost their jobs. During the 36 years of the one child policy, it was found that 324 million women were given contraception and 107 million women underwent sterilization. That means they couldn't have any more children. The one child policy resulted in thousands of forced abortions and even female infanticide. For the Chinese, having a boy meant that the family could carry on their legacy. Having a girl, on the other hand, didn't. Many Chinese families favored boys over girls, and when women were pregnant and they realized that they had a girl, They very frequently aborted this girl. Many girls also ended up in orphanages or would be left out on the street so that the parents could have another chance of having a boy. There were some exceptions to the one child policy. If the couple's first child died or was handicapped, they could have a second child. Even if there were farmers and the first child was a girl, they were allowed to try for another child, hoping that it might be a boy, to help them on the farm. You also could have more children if you paid quite a large fine. And if you were from an ethnic minority group, you could also have up to 2 or 3 children. In 2007, the one-child policy was relaxed. All rural families were allowed to have 2 children. All the people who lived in the countryside were allowed to have 2 children. This is so they could help them work on the farm. In 2007, the policy also changed, such that if there were two one-child children and they got married, they could have 2 children. So let's say there were 2 parents who had a son and another 2 parents who had a daughter. The son and the daughter were both born during the one-child policy. They were both only children. If these 2 people got married and decided to have children, they were allowed, since both of them were only children, they were allowed to have 2 children. In 2007, the government also started giving women an informed choice, started teaching women about family planning. They gave them a choice on the different types of contraception and even about abortion and sterilization, rather than forcing it on them. They also allowed voluntary family planning. So they encouraged family planning using posters such as the one that you see, rather than forcing it onto them. In 2016, finally the policy was abolished. The reasons for this was that there was a large gender imbalance. There was a large difference between the amount of men and women in the country. Since men were favored, there were a lot less women being born, and this caused many problems. The policy was also abolished because there was a large aging population. There were many old people and not enough people being born to replace them once they have passed away. Final check. Which statements about the one-child policy are correct? Pause the video and allow yourself 2 minutes to work them out. When you're done, press play and check your answers. Okay. So the first statement, couples were allowed to have a second child. That's not true. Actually, there were some exceptions, but most Chinese people were not allowed to have a second child. They decreased the marriageable age. That is not true. They increased the marriageable age. Couples had to apply to be married and before having a child. That's correct. That's true. Only ethnic couples were allowed to have more than one child. That is incorrect. Ethnic couples, farmers, and even people whose first child had passed away could have more children. In 2007, the policy allowed people to have 2 children. That's correct. In 2016, the policy was abolished. Okay, remember, geography is everywhere.